Hi students, this is video 1 of 3 to help you with your test review. So there will be 3 videos, one on each page of your test review. So the first one, you are asked to solve each quadratic equation. I'm going to be doing my work on a separate sheet of paper. So for 1A, your first job is to, when solving, make sure that your quadratic and linear term are on one side and your constant on the opposite. So I'll have 5x squared minus 2x equals negative 4. And you remember it switched signs because we have to subtract 2x and subtract 4 when we move it. Your next step is, if a is not 1, to divide every term by the leading coefficient, in this case 5. Now it goes away, so we're left with x squared minus 2/5 x. And remember, your next step is to complete the square by taking half of b and squaring it. So I'm going to go ahead and put plus blank equals negative 4/5 plus blank. Now to determine what value we're going to substitute there into our blanks, we get our calculator and type in b. Don't worry about the sign, but we type in 2 divided by 5, and we always divide by 2 to take half of it and hit enter. Our next step is to square it and convert it to a fraction by hitting math, enter, enter. So we should end up with 1 over 25. It should be a number that we can take the square root of. So I'm going to add in 1 over 25 here in my blank. Alright, next step is to factor. So to factor, we take the square root, keep the sign, and square root. That's the nice thing about completing the squares. It makes it very easy to factor. To figure out this number in our calculator, we type in negative 4 over 5 plus 1 over 25. So we get a decimal value, so we hit math, enter, enter, and we get negative 19 over 25. The last step is to solve, so we take the square root of both sides. Please remember, you have to put the plus or minus in front. Now, we know that we're taking the square root of a negative number, so it's going to involve I, and our denominator here, when we take the square root of 25, is a perfect square, so we can take the square root of that. So I want you to think about this. If I'm simplifying the square root of negative 19 over the square root of 25, which is a different representation of this number, that I would get I square roots of 19 up top, but the square root of 25 would equal 5. So that's what I use here, I square root of 19 over 5. Now my last step would be to isolate x by dividing by, or excuse me, not dividing, but adding 1/5 to both sides to zero that term out. So I'm left with x equals positive 1/5 plus or minus I squared of 19 over 5. And that is my final answer. Next, for B, 1b, you have x squared plus 12x plus 28 equals negative 8. The first thing you want to do with B is to remember that just like with step A, we need our quadratic and linear term on the left, but our constant on the right. So I'm going to subtract 28 from both sides, leaving me with x squared plus 12x plus blank equals negative 36. You can put that in your calculator if you need to. Okay? So now we take half of b and square it. So half of 12 is 6. So I'll do it over here. Half of 12 is 6. 6 squared is 36. So I'm going to add 36 to both sides. My next step is to factor that perfect square trinomial. So I have square root, keep the sign, square root. That's where the x plus 6 comes from. But it equals 0. Negative 36 plus 36 is 0. So if I take the square root of both sides, you're going to find that x plus 6 is just equal to, well, the square root of 0 is 0. So my last step would simply be to subtract 6. So my x value is negative 6. In this case, we only get one x value. What that means is if I were to graph my function here as set equal to 0, so that would be x squared plus 12x. We can keep the plus 28, but make sure we add the 8 over to set it equal to 0. That if I graph it, it only touches the x-axis one time, and it touches at negative 6. So whenever you get one solution, that means you only have one zero, and there it is, -6. It only touches once. All right, so that's how to solve using completing the square. Now for 2, you are asked to find the linear or constant term that would complete the square. So for number 2, if I want to figure out what number goes in this blank, similar to what I did with number 1, all I have to do is take half of b and square it. So this is my work, 7 divided by 2 squared. So that's 49 over 4, and that's the number that goes in your blank. That's your answer. So that was A. For B, you got x squared plus blank plus 49. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite process of what we did here. So over on 2A, to find the constant, we take the square root of this, or excuse me, not square root, but we take half of it and square it. We're actually going to do the opposite here. So if you think about it, it's like saying you don't know what the number is, some unknown value, but you're going to take half of it and square it, and when you do, you get 49. Well, if you were to think about solving that, that would mean you'd have to take the square root of both sides, and the square root of 49 is 7. Well, what number divided by 2 equals 7? That would be 14. So that is your linear coefficient, 14. Just make sure you put the x behind it so you'll have the linear term. So again here, you take half of b and square it. But on 2b, you take the square root of c and then double it. So the square root of 49 is 7. 7 doubled is 14. So again, half of b and square it for 2a, but on b, take the square root of c and double it. So that takes care of 2 and a. Now, 2a and b rather. Now let's go ahead and move on to 3. 3 asks you what value of h is needed to complete the square. So it might look a little funny, but all I'm saying is that if given x squared plus 10x minus 8 equals 0, when you come down and do your steps in vertex form, you should end up with x minus something squared minus 33. So all I'm asking you is what is this number? Because remember, this is our HK, comes from switch keep. So I'm asking you, what is this number? Well, if we complete the square, that means we put parentheses around these two terms and move our constant to the opposite side. So we have x squared plus 10x plus blank equals positive 8. That comes from adding 8 to both sides to get rid of it over here. And we have to add it to both sides. Well, now we complete the square. So we take half of 10, which is 5, and we square it and get 25. Now I'm down to my step where I factor. So this is x plus 5 quantity squared equals 33. You know what? I probably didn't need to set it equal to 0. I could have just set it equal to y. So I'm just going to move this over, and we have x plus 5 quantity squared minus 33, and that's our function, y equals. So now we have it in vertex form. So remember, if I was to ask you right now what's your vertex, which is HK, you would switch keep. So it would be -5, -33. So what's my h value? -5. Remember that in this case, x minus a -5 makes it x plus 5. So this is our vertex form, but it says what is h. So do switch keep, and there's your h value. Okay? So hopefully you actually recognize the connection. If you were to look up here, when you think about it, what's the relationship between your b value and this value when you factor? Well, it's half of it. What's half of 10? 5. So actually that's what's going to be in vertex form. It's just I've already given you the k as -33. So to get your answer tomorrow on your test, literally if you take half of that number, write it in vertex form, and then switch to get your h value. You've got it. All right, now moving on to number 4. You have to complete the square to write the quadratic function in vertex form. Please, one thing I want you to make sure you do is consistently bring down y equals. Bring down y equals for all these steps, okay? Students forget to do that, and then they get lost. So if I want this in vertex form, remember your first step is to put parentheses around your quadratic and linear term, and then complete the square with it. So if I take half of 3 and square it, 3 squared is going to give me 9/4. So remember in your calculator, if you have to, 3 divided by 2, enter, squared, enter, and then math, enter, enter. But this is what you need to consider. I really added in a positive 9/4 that wasn't there. Remember later, or you're going to end up doing one where you end up multiplying a times c. So recognize what you added into this equation was 9/4 that was not already there. If it was gone, you can see I would still just have my original 3 terms. So I added in 9/4, so I have to preserve equality by subtracting 9/4. Well, now I'm down to my factoring step, so that's just square root, keep your sign a square root. So that's going to give us x plus 3/2 quantity squared. Now to figure out this number, I'm going to pick up my calculator and type in -9 minus 9/4. And I get -45/4. So all we had to do is put it in vertex form. We're actually done at this step. Didn't even need another step. All done. So vertex form. So remember to verify on your test that you put in standard form. So x squared plus 3x minus 9. And down here, x plus 3/2 squared minus 45/4. And if you've done it right, then when you check your table, your y1 and your y2 values will be exactly the same. All right. Next, for 4b, and this is the one where if a is not equal to 1, we have to factor it out. So I'm going to come down here and put y equals a few times. And remember, a in standard form is same as the a in vertex form. That -3 should be in every single step because you have to keep the a value to maintain an equivalent expression. So I said go ahead and put parentheses around your quadratic and linear terms, and you're going to factor out a -3. So the purpose of dividing is so you see what goes in parentheses. So see how that cancels out? But be conscientious here. A -3 divided by a -3 is a positive 1x. I'm going to add a number to both sides, but I'm going to wait a second to see if I need to add or subtract here. Now, our a value is 1, our b value here is an understood 1. Be careful. Common mistake, students just plug in 1. We have to take half of 1 and square it. When we do that, we get 1/4. This should remind you of the problems that we did on the quiz. Now, to determine what I add or subtract here, I multiply -3 times a fourth. That will give me -3/4. I can just put it in my calculator if you're not sure. Just type in -3 times 1/4, and you can see it's -3/4. So because I need to preserve equality, if I bring in a negative, I have to do the opposite sign and add 3/4. So notice, keep that -3 in every step. So I'm going to factor now. To factor, I take the square root, keep the sign in square root. So x plus 1/2. And then I'm going to add these two numbers. So in my calculator, I'll just type in 8 plus 3/4. Math, enter, enter. And that's 35/4. Oh, well, I'm done. I didn't need that step either. So it is now in vertex form. Again, I recommend that you go to y equals. That was -3x squared minus 3x plus 8. And in vertex form, -3 times the quantity x plus 1/2 squared plus 35/4. And we see that our y1 and y2s are the same. So we know our answer is correct. All right, so next we're going to move on to the stuff with complex numbers, number 5. So we did one like this in our warm-up today, and it was on your exit assessment as well. Whenever we have a quantity squared, we need to remember that this is 2 minus 5i times 2 minus 5i. I gotta get a sharper pencil, just a second. Sorry about that. All right, so when I multiply this out, I'm going to do the box method to help some of you all out that I've encouraged to do that. You don't have to, as long as you get all 4 terms right and simplify correctly. So when I multiply, I get 4 minus 10i minus 10i plus 25i squared. Remember that I squared is negative 1, so this value in this corner is really negative 25, which you need to combine with 4. So 4 minus 25 is going to give us negative 21. When I combine these terms, because they're like terms, negative 10i minus 10i is negative 20i. Remember, it's just like terms. We don't change exponents. Now to that, I'm going to add, and I'll do my box here. Again, if you want to double distribute, that's fine. And you'll get 9, 12i, 12i, and 16i squared. If you feel like I'm going a little too fast, just please pause the video and try to work it out. So 16 times negative 1, so I'm going to have negative 16 in this corner, which I combine with 9. So 9 minus 16 is negative 7. And then 12i and 12i makes 24i, and that's it. So now I simply need to combine my like terms, so don't let this trip you up. So I'm going to, in my calculator, type in negative 21 plus negative 7, and that's negative 28. Then negative 20i plus 24i, that's a positive 4i. And that's my final answer. Remember, all of your answers should only have I to the first power. If you have I squared or I cubed or anything like that, you haven't simplified it enough. So again, that was 5A. For B, you simply had to do I to the 311th power. That means, remember, it's a good idea to write your chart out so you can use it when you need it. But I is I squared, negative 1, I cubed, negative I, and I to the 4th, positive 1. Remember, I 1. Where if you divide your exponent, if you divide your exponent by 4 and look at the decimal part, you pay attention to what's left over to help you know what it corresponds to. So I'm going to take the 311 and divide by 4. And it ends in 0.75, 77.75. So that means it equates to I cubed. So I to the 311th is the same thing as I cubed, which is negative I. And that would be my answer, negative I. For part C, you're only multiplying 2 binomials here. I'm just going to do the FOIL, but if you want to do box, you can. So 12 minus 42i plus 10i minus 35i squared. But this becomes negative 35 times negative 1, which is a positive 35. I'm going to combine the positive 35 with my 12 to give me 47. Combine these two like terms, and negative 42i plus 10i is negative 32i. And that's it for C. Pause it if you need, or go back and rewind if you need to review any of these again. All right, moving on, I'm going to do 5D. we have the quantity 2 minus 7i squared all over 6i. The first thing you should recognize is that you have a quantity squared, but you also, after that, need to recognize you're going to have to rationalize. So what we're going to do is we're going to figure out what this equals, the 2 minus 7i over the 6i, but then rationalize by multiplying the bottom and top by negative 6i. So I'll come over here and do the box for 2 minus 7i. So that gives me 4, negative 14i, negative 14i, positive 49i squared. 49 times negative 1 is negative 49. 4 and negative 49 make negative 45, while negative 14 minus 14 is negative 28i. So I've got negative 45 minus 28i all over 6, which I then need to multiply by negative 6i. This is all multiplication. Remember, however, that you should always end up with a positive integer for your denominator. So 6 times negative 6 is negative 36. I times I is I squared. So you're going to end up with a positive 36, which you should. It should always be positive. On the top here, you just distribute the negative 6i to both terms. And right off the top of my head, I don't know, negative 45 times negative 6. So I'm going to type it in, and I get 270. So that's 270i. And then negative 28 times negative 6 is positive 168i squared. So remember, I times I is I squared. Because I squared is equal to negative 1, I'm actually going to get a negative 168 for this term. So I always want to rewrite my answer so that my real part is first and then my imaginary part second. Now if you take a look at 168 and 270 and 36, you notice that all three terms are divisible by a common factor. I don't know what that term is, what that factor is, but I know that all three numbers are even, so I'm just going to start by dividing by a 2. So negative 168 divided by 2 is negative 84. Now if I can reduce again, I will. If I divide by 2, I get 135, bring down my I. 36 divided by 2 is 18. Now, I don't think there's any other common factor for those, so we are going to just leave it like that. But it's got to be simplified. Make sure you have your real part, then your imaginary part. Last one on this section, part E. Our denominator is 2 plus 5i, so our job is to rationalize by multiplying by the conjugate to minus 5i. So that means I need to distribute up top, and on the bottom, you can do the box, but your middle terms are going to cancel out. So I'm just going to do 4. Remember what I said, though, that this will always turn into plus, because I times I is I squared, which is negative 1. Actually, I'll hold off on that step so I don't confuse anybody. So 2 times 2 is 4. A positive times a negative is negative. 5 times 5 is 25. I times I is I squared. But I squared is negative 1, so we're going to end up with 4. And negative 25 times negative 1 is positive 25. So our denominator is 29. Since there are no common factors there, we are done. 14 minus 35i all over 29. So what I'm also going to do, I'm glad you're paying attention to the review. Let's omit problems 6 through 8. I want you to be able to finish the whole test in one period tomorrow. So let's take out 6 through 8. And I'm going to stop the video at this point since that's the end of the first page.